Picture this. You wake up in medieval Paris, the year 1348. The air is thick with smoke and something else, something putrid that catches in your throat. You wrap a cloth around your face, pull on your leather gloves, and grab your long wooden hook. Today, like every day for the past 6 months, you're going to collect the dead. Not just 1 or 2 bodies, but cartloads of them, dozens, sometimes hundreds. This is your job. You are a body collector during the Black Death, and you're about to discover that some occupations in history were so horrifying, so utterly nightmarish, that they make your worst Monday morning feel like a vacation. The cart wheels creak as you push through the narrow streets. Bodies line the cobblestones like fallen logs. Children who never saw their 5th birthday. Mothers who died clutching their infants. Fathers who collapsed mid-prayer. You hook them one by one, dragging them onto your cart with the practiced efficiency of someone who stopped feeling human months ago. The smell isn't just death. It's sweet decay mixed with human waste, rotting flesh, and the acrid smoke from lime pits where yesterday's cargo now burns. You've learned not to breathe through your nose. But here's the twisted irony. In a world where death was everywhere, you were essential. Cities paid you well because no one else would do it. You were both feared and desperately needed. Children scattered when they saw you coming. Adults crossed themselves and whispered prayers. You were the living embodiment of mortality itself, walking through streets where every door marked with a red cross meant another family had been consumed. And yet, you survived. Day after day, you handled plague victims, breathed the same contaminated air, walked through the literal valley of death. Many body collectors did survive, either through dumb luck, natural immunity, or perhaps because constant exposure to small doses of the disease built resistance. You became living proof that some jobs don't just test your stomach, they test your very humanity. But body collecting during the plague was just the beginning. Throughout history, humans have devised occupations so disturbing, so psychologically damaging, and so physically revolting that they seem designed by nightmares rather than necessity. These weren't just dirty jobs or dangerous ones. They were positions that required people to stare directly into the darkest corners of human existence and somehow find a way to keep showing up. The gong farmer knew exactly what that meant. In medieval and early modern England, human waste didn't just disappear. It accumulated in cesspits, private latrines, and the cellars of homes. When these pits filled up, someone had to empty them. That someone was the gong farmer, and their job was to descend into years of accumulated human excrement and haul it out bucket by bucket. The work happened at night, partly for public health reasons and partly because the smell was so overwhelming that it could clear entire neighborhoods. Gong farmers worked in teams, often wearing minimal clothing that they would burn afterward. They carried long-handled tools and worked by torchlight in pits that could be 10 feet deep or more. The methane gas from decomposing waste could be deadly. Men passed out from toxic fumes. Some never woke up. But perhaps the most haunting aspect was the social isolation. Gong farmers were required by law to live outside town boundaries. They couldn't enter taverns, attend church, or participate in community life. Even their children were often banned from interacting with other kids. The job paid relatively well because no one else would do it, but the money came with complete social exile. You were necessary but untouchable, essential but reviled, and the smell never left. Gong farmers reported that after years in the profession, they lost the ability to smell anything else. Their clothes, their homes, their very skin seemed permanently saturated with the stench of human waste. Some said they could taste it in their food, smell it in clean water. The job didn't just require you to work in sewage, it transformed you into something that polite society couldn't bear to acknowledge. Yet someone had to do it. Before modern sanitation, cities would have drowned in their own waste without these midnight workers. Gong farmers prevented disease outbreaks, kept communities livable, and maintained the basic hygiene that made urban life possible. They were public health heroes who were treated like pariahs, essential workers who were forced to live as outcasts. But if you think handling human waste was the bottom of the barrel, consider the knocker-upper. In industrial Britain, before alarm clocks became common, working-class people needed to wake up for their factory shifts. Someone had to ensure that mill workers, dockers, and other laborers got up at 4 or 5 in the morning. Enter the knocker-upper, a person whose job was to walk through sleeping neighborhoods and tap on windows with a long stick until people woke up. Sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? But the reality was far more unsettling. Knocker-uppers worked in the dead of night and early morning hours, creeping through dark streets, peering into windows, and disturbing people's sleep. They knew intimate details about every family on their route. Who slept alone, who slept together, who drank too much and was hard to wake. They saw domestic violence through windows, witnessed affairs, observed child neglect. They became unwitting keepers of neighborhood secrets that they could never speak about without losing their livelihood. Many knocker-uppers were elderly women or disabled men who couldn't do factory work. They carried long bamboo poles or used gravel to tap windows, sometimes for hours until their clients stirred. In winter, they worked in freezing temperatures, often in rain or snow. Their feet would go numb, their hands would crack and bleed from the cold, but they couldn't stop because dozens of families depended on them to keep their jobs. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine spending your life watching other people sleep, seeing them at their most vulnerable, knowing their routines better than their own families did. Knocker-uppers reported feeling like ghosts, like they existed in a world parallel to normal life, but never quite part of it. They were intimately connected to entire communities, yet profoundly alone. And the responsibility was crushing. If a knocker-upper failed to wake someone, that person could lose their job, their income, their family's livelihood. One missed window, one moment of inattention, and you could destroy someone's life. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the isolation and the strange intimacy of watching people sleep, created a job that was psychologically devastating in ways that few other occupations could match. But these jobs pale in comparison to the sin eater, a profession so macabre that it seems pulled from the darkest folklore. In parts of England, Wales, and Scotland, when someone died, their family would hire a person to literally eat their sins. The sin eater would come to the funeral, place bread and ale on the chest of the deceased, consume them while reciting prayers. The belief was that by eating this food in the presence of the dead, the sin-eater absorbed all the deceased person's sins, allowing the soul to enter heaven pure and unburdened. Think about what this meant. Every bite of bread carried someone's adultery, their greed, their violence, their cruelty. Every sip of ale contained their lies, their betrayals, their failures. The sin-eater became a human repository for moral corruption, a living garbage disposal for spiritual waste. They were believed to carry the accumulated evil of entire communities within their own soul. Sin-eaters were social outcasts in the most literal sense. They couldn't enter churches because they were considered spiritually contaminated. They couldn't marry because no one would willingly bind themselves to someone carrying the sins of the dead. They lived alone, often in hovels on the outskirts of settlements, surviving on payment from funerals and charity from people who simultaneously needed and reviled them. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine believing, truly believing, that your soul contains the worst impulses and moral failures of hundreds of dead people. that every evil thought you have might not be your own, but something you absorbed from a corpse, that you are literally filled with the spiritual poison of others. Sin eaters often became alcoholics, not just from access to funeral ale, but as a way to numb the horror of what they believed they had become. And yet they continued. Generation after generation, people took on this role because communities needed it. Death was too important, too terrifying, to leave anything to chance. If paying someone to eat your father's sins gave you peace, if it meant he could rest in heaven instead of purgatory, then the cost was worth it. Sin eaters provided psychological comfort to the living while damning themselves to spiritual isolation. The truly horrifying part wasn't just the social isolation or the psychological burden. It was the theological trap. Sin eaters were necessary for other people's salvation, but were themselves considered beyond redemption. They were saviors who could never be saved, healers who could never be healed. The very act that made them useful to society rendered them spiritually untouchable. But even sin eaters had more agency than the tasters, people whose job was to eat food before it reached someone important, usually royalty or nobility. The goal was simple. If the food was poisoned, the taster would die instead of the person who mattered. Your life was literally less valuable than someone else's appetite. Tasters weren't volunteers. They were usually servants, prisoners, or slaves who had no choice in the matter. They lived in constant fear that their next meal would be their last. Every bite carried the possibility of agony and death. Some poisons killed quickly, but others caused days of suffering. Arsenic created burning stomach pain, bloody vomit, and slow organ failure. Mercury poisoning led to neurological damage, tremors, and madness before death. The psychological torture was as bad as the physical risk. Tasters had to appear calm and composed while eating potentially lethal food. They couldn't show fear, couldn't hesitate, couldn't do anything that might suggest the food was dangerous. They became expert actors, performing normalcy while terrified. Many developed eating disorders, unable to consume food without anxiety even when they weren't working. And the job never ended. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, wine, water tasters were required to sample everything that passed their employer's lips. They lived in a state of constant vigilance, knowing that their next moment of relaxation could be their last. Some tasters lasted decades without incident. Others died within weeks. The randomness was part of the horror. You never knew if you were safe or doomed. Worse, tasters often grew attached to the people they protected. They weren't just servants, but intimate companions who shared meals and conversation. When assassination attempts occurred, tasters didn't just face death, they faced the betrayal of dying for someone who saw them as disposable. The relationship was fundamentally unequal. The taster would die for the master, but the master would replace the taster without hesitation. Yet perhaps no job in history combined psychological horror with social necessity quite like the professional mourner. In cultures across the world, grief had to be performed publicly and dramatically. When someone important died, their family would hire people to cry, wail, and display extreme sorrow at the funeral. These weren't just actors, they were emotional vessels for community grief. Professional mourners studied the deceased beforehand, learning their life story, their accomplishments, their relationships. They had to cry as if they had lost their own family member, scream as if their own heart was breaking. The performance had to be authentic enough to move an entire crowd to tears. They were grief artists, pain performers, masters of manufactured sorrow. The emotional toll was crushing. Professional mourners spent their days immersed in other people's loss, surrounding themselves with death and despair. They attended funerals daily, sometimes multiple funerals per day during plague years or times of war. They became experts in human suffering, connoisseurs of grief, living libraries of loss. Many professional mourners reported that they lost the ability to feel genuine emotion. After years of performing grief, their own sadness felt artificial. When their own family members died, they found themselves analyzing their grief instead of experiencing it, critiquing their performance instead of mourning their loss. The job colonized their emotional life, turning authentic feeling into professional skill. But the work was essential. In societies where public displays of grief were crucial for social cohesion, professional mourners ensured that every death received proper recognition. They gave voice to community loss, transformed individual tragedy into collective mourning, and provided comfort to families who might not be able to express their own pain adequately. The most skilled mourners could improvise elaborate lamentations, weaving together the deceased's biography with traditional funeral poetry. They became oral historians, preserving the stories of the dead through their performances. But this also meant they carried the weight of countless life stories, countless tragedies, countless moments of human loss. And then there were the whipping boys, perhaps the most psychologically twisted job in royal courts. When a prince misbehaved, he couldn't be punished directly because his body was considered sacred. Instead, another boy, usually of noble birth but lower status, would be beaten in his place. The theory was that the prince would learn virtue by watching someone else suffer for his mistakes. Whipping boys were chosen in childhood and raised alongside the prince, becoming companions and playmates. They shared lessons, games, and daily life. Then, when the prince did something wrong, broke a vase, failed a lesson, showed disrespect, the whipping boy would be stripped and beaten while the prince watched. The psychological damage to both children was immense. For the whipping boy, every day carried the threat of pain for someone else's actions. They had no control over their fate, no way to protect themselves except by constantly monitoring and influencing the prince's behavior. They became hypervigilant, anxious, desperate to prevent any situation that might lead to punishment. Many whipping boys developed severe anxiety disorders, unable to relax even in adulthood. But the prince suffered too. Imagine watching your best friend screaming in agony because of something you did. Imagine learning that your actions had consequences, but that someone else always paid the price. Some princes were tormented by guilt and became obsessively careful. Others became psychopathic, learning that they could inflict suffering without personal consequences. The relationship between prince and whipping boy was impossibly complex. They were friends, but also victim and perpetrator. They shared everything except suffering, which only one of them experienced. Some whipping boys grew to hate their princes. Others became fiercely protective, seeing themselves as martyrs. Some princes treated their whipping boys with tenderness and guilt. Others learned to feel nothing at all. The job usually ended when the prince reached adulthood, but the psychological scars lasted forever. Whipping boys often struggled with relationships, unable to trust that they wouldn't be hurt for someone else's mistakes. They had learned that suffering was arbitrary, that pain could come without warning or reason. Many never recovered from the trauma of a childhood spent bearing the consequences of another person's choices. Yet even whipping boys seem fortunate compared to the fowlers, people whose job was to clean the inside of chimneys by crawling through them with brushes and scrapers. In industrial era Britain, fowlers were usually children, some as young as 6 or 7, who were small enough to fit inside the narrow flues that carried smoke from fireplaces to rooftops. The work was deadly in every possible way. Soot inhalation caused lung disease that killed most fowlers before they reached adulthood. The soot itself was carcinogenic, causing scrotal cancer so common among chimney sweeps that it was called sweeps cancer. Children regularly got stuck in chimneys and suffocated. Others fell to their deaths from rooftops. Some were burned alive when fireplaces were accidentally lit while they were inside. But the immediate horror was claustrophobia and panic. Imagine being a small child forced to crawl through spaces barely wider than your body, in complete darkness, surrounded by toxic dust that burns your eyes and lungs. The chimney walls scrape against your skin, tearing it raw. Your knees and elbows bleed from crawling on rough stone. You can't see where you're going, can't breathe properly, can't turn around. Many children panicked and became wedged in chimneys, unable to move forward or backward. Their screams echoed down the flue while adults tried desperately to extract them. Some were pulled out alive but traumatized. Others died slow, terrifying deaths trapped in darkness, their cries growing weaker until they stopped altogether. The psychological damage to survivors was immense. Children developed severe claustrophobia, unable to enter any enclosed space without panic attacks. They suffered nightmares about being trapped, about suffocating, about burning alive. Many became unable to sleep indoors, preferring to rest in open fields or doorways where they could see the sky. And the social isolation was crushing. Fowlers were covered in soot that stained their skin permanently. They smelled of smoke and chemicals. Their stunted growth and damaged health marked them as different from other children. They were essential workers. City fireplaces wouldn't function without them, but they were treated as disposable, replaceable, barely human. The job created its own culture of survival. Experienced fowlers taught newcomers which chimneys were safe, which homeowners were kind, how to avoid getting stuck. They developed songs and rhymes to mark distances in dark flues, created tools from bent wire and rags. They formed their own communities because no one else would accept them. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging job in history belonged to the professional hermits. People hired by wealthy landowners to live alone in artificial caves or huts on their estates, pretending to be religious mystics for the entertainment of guests. These hermits had to remain in character constantly, speaking in cryptic riddles, wearing rags, and maintaining an appearance of otherworldly wisdom. The job required complete social isolation. Hermits lived alone for years, sometimes decades, with minimal human contact. They couldn't break character, couldn't have normal conversations, couldn't form relationships. They were human decorations, living exhibitions of fake spirituality designed to impress visitors with their employer's sophistication and wealth. The psychological toll was devastating. Professional hermits reported losing the ability to communicate normally. After years of speaking only in mystic riddles and biblical quotations, they forgot how to have ordinary conversations. They became genuinely isolated, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. Some experienced complete psychological breaks, becoming actually delusional rather than just pretending to be. The job required them to perform madness so convincingly that they often became genuinely mad. They studied real hermits and holy men, learning to mimic the appearance of divine inspiration. But the line between performance and reality blurred. When you spend years pretending to be crazy, talking to yourself, and avoiding human contact, you begin to lose the ability to distinguish between acting and being. Many professional hermits became addicted to alcohol or opium, the only escape from the relentless performance of their role. They were forbidden from leaving their character or their designated space, trapped in an elaborate theatrical production that never ended. They were performers who became their performance, actors who lost themselves in their role. And the most horrifying aspect was the meaninglessness. Unlike other terrible jobs that served some social function, professional hermits existed purely for entertainment. They suffered for no reason except to amuse wealthy people who wanted to feel spiritual without actually being spiritual. They were human curiosities, living art installations designed to create a sense of mystique and depth. The contracts for professional hermits sometimes lasted decades. They were paid well, but the money came with the requirement to surrender their identity, their relationships, their sanity. They became professionally alone, occupationally isolated, deliberately mad. Some hermits served out their contracts and emerged into a world they no longer understood. Others never emerged at all, dying alone in their artificial caves, forgotten by employers who had moved on to newer forms of entertainment. But even professional hermits had more choice than the castrati, boys who were castrated before puberty to preserve their high-singing voices for church choirs and opera houses. This wasn't just a job, it was a permanent physical mutilation that shaped every aspect of their lives. Castrati were created, not born. Their bodies altered to serve an aesthetic purpose that society valued more than their bodily integrity. The surgery was performed on boys as young as 8 or 9, usually from poor families who saw it as their son's only path to prosperity. The operation was dangerous. Many children died from infection or blood loss. Those who survived faced a lifetime of physical and psychological consequences. They never experienced puberty, never developed normal adult bodies, never had the possibility of sexual relationships or children. But their voices were extraordinary. Castrati combined the purity and range of a child's voice with the power and breath control of an adult's lungs. They could sing notes that no other human could produce, creating sounds that audiences described as angelic, otherworldly, divine. They were living musical instruments, human beings whose bodies had been modified to create perfect sound. The most successful castrati became celebrities, earning enormous amounts of money and attracting devoted fans. They were the pop stars of their era, mobbed by crowds and showered with gifts. But their fame came at the cost of their humanity. They were neither fully male nor female, neither child nor adult. They existed in a liminal space that society created for them, but could never fully accept. Many castrati struggled with identity and relationships throughout their lives. They were desired as performers, but feared as people. Their sexuality was ambiguous, their bodies strange, their voices beautiful but unnatural. They were revered and reviled, celebrated and pitied. Some found love and companionship despite their circumstances. Others lived in profound isolation, surrounded by admirers but deeply alone. The psychological impact was immense. Castrati had to reconcile themselves to a choice made for them in childhood, a choice that shaped every aspect of their adult lives. They had to find meaning in their sacrifice, value in their suffering, identity in their difference. Some became devoutly religious, seeing their condition as a form of divine service. Others became bitter and resentful, feeling cheated of a normal life, and the job never ended. Castrati were performers until their voices failed or they died. They couldn't retire to normal lives because they had never had normal lives. They were professionally different, occupationally other, their entire existence shaped by a decision made before they could understand its consequences. Yet, perhaps, the most psychologically complex job in history belonged to the executioners, people whose profession was dealing death. Unlike soldiers who killed in battle or criminals who killed in passion, executioners killed methodically, ritually, as a public service. They were the official face of state violence, the human embodiment of society's ultimate punishment. Executioners were both necessary and reviled. Society needed them to maintain order and justice, but no one wanted to associate with them. They were essential workers who were treated as pariahs, public servants who were socially untouchable. Many executioner positions were hereditary because no one else would take the job willingly. The work required technical skill and emotional detachment. Executioners had to know anatomy, understand the mechanics of death, practice their craft until they could kill efficiently and humanely. A botched execution was seen as torture, a skilled one as mercy. They were craftsmen of death, artisans of ending, professionals who had to take pride in their ability to kill cleanly. But the psychological toll was immense. Executioners reported nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty forming relationships. They saw fear in every person's eyes when their profession was revealed. Children ran from them. Adults crossed themselves. Even priests struggled to offer them communion. They were living reminders of mortality, human symbols of society's capacity for violence. Many executioners developed elaborate rituals and justifications for their work. Some became deeply religious, seeing themselves as agents of divine justice. Others became philosophical, convinced that death was a natural part of life that they simply facilitated. Some became drunk or addicted, numbing themselves against the weight of their actions. The job required them to be both completely ruthless and completely controlled. They had to suppress empathy while maintaining humanity, kill strangers while preserving their own sanity. They were professional killers who weren't allowed to be killers, state agents who weren't allowed to be violent, death dealers who had to remain psychologically alive. And the responsibility was crushing. In their hands lay the power to end human life, to transform breathing people into corpses, to turn someone's last moments into agony or peace. They carried the weight of every death they caused, every family they destroyed, every life they ended. Some executioners kept detailed records of their victims, carrying their names and stories like a burden. Others tried to forget, to treat each execution as just another task. But executioners also served an essential social function. They made justice possible, gave closure to victims' families, and maintained the social order that allowed communities to function. They were the final link in the chain of law and order, the people who ensured that society's ultimate punishments were actually carried out. Yet, there were jobs even more psychologically devastating than executioner, positions that required not just taking life, but preserving it in the most horrifying circumstances. The plague doctors of medieval Europe wore their iconic beaked masks not as a costume, but as protection against the very air they breathed. Inside those elongated leather beaks were herbs and spices. Aromatics meant to filter the contaminated air that carried the Black Death from house to house, street to street, soul to soul. But the mask did more than protect it transformed. When you put on that bird-like visage, you ceased to be human in the eyes of everyone around you. You became a harbinger of death, a creature that existed at the boundary between the living and the dead. Children screamed when they saw you coming. Adults fell to their knees in prayer or despair. You were both savior and omen, healer and harbinger, the person people called when hope was lost, but still clung to desperately. The work was a study in futility wrapped in terror. Plague doctors visited homes where entire families lay dying, their bodies covered in the black buboes that gave the disease its name. They lanced swellings with crude instruments, applied poultices that did nothing, and prescribed treatments that were useless at best and harmful at worst. They knew they couldn't cure the plague, but they had to try. They were medical professionals in an age when medicine was little more than educated guessing mixed with prayer. And they were always alone. Plague doctors worked in isolation, unable to form relationships because everyone they met was either dying or terrified of catching death from them. They couldn't touch other people, couldn't share meals, couldn't find comfort in human contact. The leather gloves, long robes, and protective gear that kept them alive also kept them isolated from all human warmth. Many plague doctors went mad from the isolation and the constant exposure to death. They talked to themselves inside their masks, carried on conversations with corpses, developed elaborate delusions about their ability to communicate with the dead. Some began to believe they were supernatural beings rather than humans, that the mask had transformed them into something otherworldly. Others became convinced that they were already dead, that they had died of plague long ago, but continued to exist as spirits doomed to minister to the dying. The job attracted different types of people for different reasons. Some were genuine physicians, trying to help during humanity's darkest hour. Others were charlatans who saw opportunity in desperation. Many were simply poor people who took the job because it paid well and they had no other options. But regardless of why they started, the work changed them all. It was impossible to spend months walking through dying cities, visiting plague houses, touching infected bodies, and remain psychologically intact. And the guilt was overwhelming. Plague doctors knew that most of their patients would die regardless of treatment. They watched families dissolve, children become orphans, entire communities disappear. They were witnesses to apocalypse, chroniclers of civilization's collapse, healers who couldn't heal in humanity's hour of greatest need. Some plague doctors kept detailed journals, recording the names and symptoms of their patients, creating archives of suffering that no one wanted to read, but someone had to preserve. But perhaps even more psychologically damaging were the resurrection men, the body snatchers who supplied corpses to medical schools in the 18th and 19th centuries. Before laws allowed doctors to use executed criminals for dissection, medical education required fresh corpses that could only be obtained illegally. Someone had to dig up recently buried bodies and deliver them to anatomy professors who needed them to teach students about human biology. Resurrection men worked at night, usually in teams of 2 or 3. They would locate fresh graves, dig up the coffins, remove the bodies, and transport them to medical schools in sacks or carts. The work required speed, stealth, and stomach-churning disregard for the sanctity of death. They had to desecrate burial grounds, violate the rest of the dead, and steal what families considered most precious, the physical remains of their loved ones. The psychological impact was devastating. Resurrection men lived in constant fear of being caught by authorities, attacked by angry mobs, or cursed by the families of the dead. They developed elaborate superstitions about their work, believing that certain rituals could protect them from supernatural revenge. Many became alcoholics, using drink to numb their guilt and terror. Others developed obsessive behaviors, checking and rechecking graves to ensure they hadn't been discovered. But the most horrifying aspect was the intimacy of the work. Resurrection men didn't just steal corpses, they had to handle them. They touched dead flesh, lifted bodies that were beginning to decompose, looked into the faces of people who had been beloved by families that were still mourning. They knew details about the dead that families didn't share, names carved on coffin plates, personal items buried with bodies, signs of how people had died. Some resurrection men kept detailed records of their work, noting which graveyards had the freshest bodies, which families buried their dead with valuable items, which doctors paid the highest prices for different types of corpses. They became experts in death and decay, professionals of the macabre, businessmen whose commodity was human remains. And they were always haunted by the knowledge that someday they too would be buried, and someone like them might dig up their bodies. The job created a terrible awareness of mortality, a constant reminder that death was not an ending, but potentially just another beginning to someone else's nightmare. Many resurrection men became obsessed with their own burial. Arrangements paying for expensive coffins, remote burial sites, anything that might protect them from their own profession. Yet they served an essential function. Without body snatchers, medical education would have been impossible. Doctors needed to understand human anatomy to save lives, and that understanding could only come from studying corpses. Resurrection men made modern medicine possible, even as they violated everything that society held sacred about death and burial. But even resurrection men seem fortunate compared to the rattlesnake wranglers of colonial America, people whose job was to capture venomous snakes for their oil, which was believed to have medicinal properties. This wasn't a job for trained professionals or experienced handlers. It was work done by poor farmers and desperate laborers who needed money and were willing to risk death for it. Rattlesnake wranglers worked with primitive tools and no protective equipment. They used forked sticks to pin snakes, grabbed them by the tail and neck, and dropped them into sacks or barrels. Every capture carried the risk of a bite that could kill within hours. There was no antivenom, no medical treatment beyond crude remedies that rarely worked. A single mistake meant certain death, and mistakes were common. The psychological toll was immense. Wranglers lived in constant fear, knowing that their next snake could be their last. They developed elaborate rituals and superstitions about their work, believing that certain prayers or charms could protect them from bites. Many became convinced that they had supernatural protection, that they were immune to venom or blessed by higher powers. Others descended into paranoia, seeing snakes everywhere, hearing rattles in every sound. The work attracted people who were already on society's margins, desperate farmers whose crops had failed, men running from the law, laborers who couldn't find other work. It was a job for people who had nothing left to lose except their lives, and many of them lost those too. The mortality rate among rattlesnake wranglers was astronomical. Most died within their first year, either from snake bites or from the psychological stress of living in constant terror. But the demand for snake oil was enormous. People believed it could cure everything from arthritis to consumption, and they were willing to pay high prices for it. This created a lucrative but deadly market that attracted desperate people who saw snake wrangling as their only path to prosperity. The irony was that most snake oil was fake, cut with other oils or completely fabricated. People were dying to capture snakes for a product that was largely worthless. And then there were the ice cutters of the northern United States and Canada, people whose job was to harvest ice from frozen lakes and rivers during winter. This might sound relatively pleasant compared to handling plague victims or venomous snakes, but ice cutting was one of the most dangerous jobs in North America, with a mortality rate that rivaled mining or logging. Ice cutters worked on frozen lakes in temperatures that regularly reached 30 or 40 degrees below zero. They used handsaws and picks to cut blocks of ice weighing hundreds of pounds, then loaded them onto sleds for transport to ice houses. The work required enormous physical strength and endurance, but more importantly, it required constant vigilance about ice thickness and stability. The greatest danger was falling through the ice. Ice cutters worked on frozen surfaces that they themselves were weakening by cutting. They had to judge ice thickness by eye and experience, knowing that a mistake meant plunging into water so cold that survival was measured in minutes. When someone fell through, rescue was often impossible. The cold water would cause immediate shock and rapid hypothermia. Heavy winter clothing would drag victims down. By the time help arrived, it was usually too late. But even when they stayed on solid ice, the work was devastating to human health. Ice cutters suffered from constant exposure to extreme cold, leading to frostbite, hypothermia, and chronic health problems. Their hands would crack and bleed from handling ice with primitive gloves. Their feet would freeze in their boots, sometimes leading to amputation. Their lungs would burn from breathing frigid air for hours at a time. The psychological impact was severe. Ice cutters lived in constant fear of the ice giving way beneath them. They heard every crack, felt every shift in the surface, knew that the thing supporting them was also the thing most likely to kill them. Many developed anxiety disorders, unable to trust any surface, unable to sleep without nightmares about drowning in freezing water. And the isolation was crushing. Ice cutting was seasonal work that took men away from their families for months at a time. They lived in primitive camps near the cutting sites, often in unheated shacks that provided little shelter from the cold. They worked in teams, but the nature of the work made conversation difficult and camaraderie rare. The cold made everyone irritable and withdrawn. Friendships were hard to maintain when everyone was focused on personal survival. Yet, the work was essential. Before refrigeration, ice was the only way to preserve food through warm months. Ice cutters made possible the transport of fresh meat, dairy products, and other perishables across long distances. They enabled the growth of cities by allowing urban populations to eat fresh food year-round. Their work was fundamental to the development of modern commerce and urban life. But perhaps no job in history combined physical danger with psychological horror, quite like the professional duelists of 18th and 19th century Europe. These weren't gentlemen defending their honor. They were hired fighters who stood in for wealthy men who wanted to settle disputes through combat, but didn't want to risk their own lives. Professional duelists fought with pistols, swords, or whatever weapons their employers preferred. They studied their opponents, practiced constantly, and developed reputations based on their skill and survival rate. The best duelists could command enormous fees, but they earned that money by literally putting their lives on the line for other people's pride and honor. The psychological pressure was immense. Duelists knew that every fight could be their last, that their next opponent might be faster, more skilled, or simply luckier. They lived in a state of constant preparation for death, unable to relax, unable to plan for the future, unable to form lasting relationships because everyone they met might someday be ordered to kill them. And the moral complexity was devastating. Duelists often fought over disputes they had no stake in, killed or died for causes they didn't understand or believe in. They were warriors without wars, soldiers without armies, killers without personal motivation. Some duelists tried to maintain a code of honor, fighting only for worthy causes or refusing certain types of disputes. Others became completely mercenary, willing to fight anyone for any reason as long as the price was right. The job attracted different types of people. Some were former soldiers who knew no other life besides fighting. Others were poor men who saw dueling as their only path to wealth and status. Many were psychologically damaged individuals who were drawn to violence and danger. But regardless of their background, the work changed them all. It was impossible to spend years killing people professionally and remain psychologically healthy. And the loneliness was profound. Duelists couldn't afford close friendships because any friend might someday become an opponent. They couldn't trust romantic partners because relationships made them vulnerable to emotional manipulation. They lived apart from normal society, existing in a shadow world of violence and money, where human life was literally a commodity to be bought and sold. Yet these jobs shared something beyond their individual horrors. They represented society's willingness to sacrifice human dignity for convenience, profit, or entertainment. Every one of these positions required people to surrender fundamental aspects of their humanity to serve functions that civilization needed but couldn't acknowledge. The resurrection men violated the sacred boundary between life and death. The plague doctors sacrificed their human connections to minister to the dying. The rattlesnake wranglers traded their safety for money. The ice cutters risked their lives for commerce. The professional duelists sold their morality for violence. Each job demanded a different type of sacrifice, but all demanded sacrifice nonetheless. And perhaps most importantly, these jobs were almost always filled by society's most vulnerable people. The poor, the desperate, the marginalized, the people who had no other choices. Society created these horrible positions and then ensured that only the powerless would fill them. The wealthy didn't send their own children into chimneys or plague houses or dueling grounds. They paid other people's children to do it for them. This pattern reveals something dark about human civilization, the willingness to preserve the comfort and safety of some by sacrificing the humanity of others. Every society has had its versions of these jobs, its ways of ensuring that necessary but horrible work gets done without those in power having to dirty their own hands. But the history of these creepy careers also reveals something hopeful about human progress. The gradual recognition that some jobs are too horrible to ask people to do. We've eliminated most of these positions not just through technological advancement, but through moral evolution, through the growing understanding that human dignity has value beyond economic utility. Today, we have laws protecting workers, regulations ensuring safety, social support systems for those who do dangerous or psychologically difficult work. We recognize that some jobs can damage the people who do them, and we try to minimize that damage through training, equipment, psychological support, and fair compensation. We've learned that efficiency isn't everything, that some costs are too high to pay, that some sacrifices shouldn't be asked of anyone. We've developed technologies that eliminate the need for human beings to do the most dangerous and degrading work. Machines now do much of what once required people to sacrifice their health, safety, and sanity. But the legacy of these historical jobs remains in the form of institutional memory, social conscience, and hard-won wisdom about the true cost of civilization. We remember them not just as curiosities or horror stories, but as reminders of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Because even today, there are jobs that require people to sacrifice aspects of their humanity. First responders who see humanity at its worst, social workers who absorb other people's trauma, soldiers who kill and risk death for causes they may not fully understand. The difference is that we now recognize these sacrifices, honor these workers, and provide support for the psychological toll they endure. The creepiest jobs in history teach us that progress isn't just about better technology or higher living standards, it's about expanding our definition of human dignity, about recognizing that everyone deserves work that affirms rather than destroys their humanity. Yet, in the end, all of these jobs share something profound. They required people to sacrifice essential aspects of their humanity for the functioning of society. Whether it was body collectors handling plague victims, gong farmers cleaning human waste, or executioners dealing death, these workers gave up normal social relationships, psychological health, and sometimes their very identities to perform tasks that civilization needed but could not acknowledge. They were the shadow workers of history, the people who did the jobs that everyone else was too afraid, too disgusted, or too civilized to do. They existed in the margins of society, essential but invisible, necessary but unwanted. They remind us that civilization has always depended on people willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, even when that sacrifice went unrecognized and unrewarded. Today, we have machines and systems that handle many of these tasks. We have sewage treatment plants instead of gong farmers, alarm clocks instead of knocker-uppers, modern medicine instead of sin-eaters. But we still have jobs that require people to sacrifice aspects of their humanity. Bomb disposal experts who face death daily, social workers who absorb human suffering, emergency responders who see humanity at its worst. The difference is that we now recognize these sacrifices, honor these workers, and provide support for the psychological toll they endure. We understand that some jobs damage the people who do them, and we try to mitigate that damage through training, counseling, and social support. But the history of the creepiest jobs reminds us of something important. Civilization is not clean or simple or easy. It requires people to do difficult, dangerous, and sometimes horrifying work. It depends on individuals willing to sacrifice their comfort, their health, their relationships, and sometimes their sanity for the benefit of others. These historical workers were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were not celebrated or honored or remembered fondly, but they were essential. They were the people who kept society functioning when no one else would step forward. They were the ones who did the jobs that everyone else was grateful existed, but hoped never to do themselves. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from these creepy careers. Every society depends on people willing to do the work that others cannot or will not do. Whether it's collecting plague victims or cleaning sewage or bearing the sins of the dead, someone has to step forward. Someone has to sacrifice. Someone has to do the job that everyone else is glad they don't have. So the next time you complain about your work, remember the knocker-uppers walking through freezing streets, the sin-eaters carrying the moral weight of entire communities, the fowlers crawling through deadly chimneys. Remember that your worst day at the office is probably better than their best day on the job, and be grateful that progress has eliminated the need for most of these horrifying occupations. Because in the end, that might be the truest measure of civilization. Not what we're willing to do, but what we're no longer willing to make people do. The creepiest jobs in history remind us that progress isn't just about new technology or better living conditions. It's also about recognizing human dignity, acknowledging the cost of the work we ask people to do, and finding ways to meet society's needs without sacrificing the souls of those who serve. The body collectors and gong farmers and professional hermits of history gave up their humanity so that we could keep ours. The least we can do is remember them, honor their sacrifice, and ensure that the work of civilization never again requires such complete self-destruction. Because everyone deserves a job they can live with, not just survive.